Welcome to part 5 of this epic modular Mordheim table build. In this episode, we'll be painting the canal sections of the board. We'll be focusing solely on the painting. The canal sections will eventually be finished with 2-part resin, creating a dark, grimy river effect. However, that will have to wait until the next episode. There are only 2 canal tiles, and can hardly be called a canal at all. However, according to the lore of Mordheim, the Quayside district is directly connected to the River Ster, which I imagine running just off to the left of these tiles. Before the comet struck, this was a busy unloading area for merchants and travelers. Now, the waterways are more likely used to smuggle precious wordstone out of the city of the damned. Why not build a full canal system? That's a fair question. After all, everyone loves a canal, and believe me, I do too. The visual appeal is hard to argue with. A canal instantly adds atmosphere and character to a board. However, I'm a strong believer that gameplay should come before spectacle. One of the biggest advantages of a modular board is flexibility, and if you always have a canal running through the table, that flexibility starts to disappear. By limiting the canal to just 2 tiles, I can place it wherever it makes the most sense for a particular game. It doesn't always have to run through the middle of the board. So while I absolutely love canals and the atmosphere they bring, I'm hoping these 2 tiles will give us the visual benefits without sacrificing gameplay. The dockside crane I now realize is printed too big. I really like it, but they'll be real hard to fit on the board. I'll be keeping these as separate tiles so they can be used independently if needed. That also gives me the option to change my mind later and build a larger canal section if I decide. That's the direction I want to take. Keeping these canal pieces separated also makes a lot of sense from a storage perspective. Let's get started, shall we? Since I'm going to be using a spray can to prime these tiles, I first need to protect the XPS foam. The propellant in spray paint can melt exposed foam, and that's definitely not something I want to risk. So to prevent that, I'm applying a coat of cheap black acrylic paint with an equally cheap brush to all the areas that will eventually be covered by epoxy resin. After that, I'll be using tape to completely mask off those sections. Honestly, I don't dare do it any other way. Can you imagine spending all this time building the board, only to watch the entire center section melt away because of a few seconds with a spray can? I ended up applying 2 coats of the black paint to make sure the foam was fully protected and covered properly. Before we move on to priming, I'm just taking a few minutes to finish things off by filling some of the gaps with filler. Nothing too fancy here, just smoothing out the larger seams and imperfections. After priming, I noticed that the seams between the pavement sections were still a bit too visible. I applied some additional filler, sanded everything smooth with 180 grit sandpaper, and then primed the tiles again. Now it's time for the usual first layer of dry brushing, using a medium gray acrylic paint. At this stage, we can be pretty rough with the application and don't need to worry about getting perfectly even coverage. In fact, I actually want some of the black primer to show through in places. Those darker areas will help create natural shadows and add depth to the surface right from the start. Putting this layer on is really quick and straightforward. In fact, the footage from both canal tiles adds up to only about 20 minutes in total. For the second layer, I'm using a titanium white acrylic paint. Here, it's important to use a very light touch, only catching the highest points of the texture and leaving the darker tones underneath untouched. It's also a very quick stage. I timed it, and this entire layer took only about 7 minutes to complete. I'll be testing this method on one corner first, as it's not something I've tried before. It can be difficult to judge the final result while you're still painting, and to be honest, at this stage I'm not entirely convinced it's going to look brilliant. But that's part of the process. Let's see how it turns out. Next, we'll be creating that old discolored dockside algae look. I'll start with a black oil wash, loading the brush with paint and then soaking it in thinner to create a very thin, workable mix. Here I'm aiming for a gradual fade upward from the waterline. Since I only plan to pour about 5 to 7 millimeters of epoxy resin, I'm painting from the bottom up, keeping the darkest staining closest to where the water would naturally sit. This helps create the impression of years of moisture, algae, and grime building up along the dock walls. I think it looks pretty good now that it's dried. Next, we'll add some green contrast paint to create an algae effect. I'm not going to be particularly careful here. I'll just slap it on and let it do its thing. It looks completely crazy when it's first applied, far brighter and messier than you'd expect. Once it dries and settles down, it usually blends in much better and starts to look a lot more natural. Except for the rust that we'll add later, this is about as much time and effort as I'm going to spend on this stage. I like seeing steady progress, and at the end of the day, we're building a gaming board, not a display diorama. For this project, playability is more important than chasing perfection. That doesn't mean we're cutting corners. We still want it to look great on the tabletop. But I'm always trying to balance visual quality with the reality of getting the board finished and ready for games. I'm quite happy with how this turned out, and I'll finish the rest of the tiles using the same approach. I wasn't too happy with the cheap black acrylic paint I used on the XPS foam. When I removed the masking tape, some of the paint came off with it, so I had to repaint those areas. Lesson learned for future projects. Looking at it now, though, I think I may have overdone the rust running from the chains. In my mind, I imagined them being heavily corroded after years of exposure to the elements. But once everything dried, the effect ended up looking a bit stronger than I intended. On the other chains, I was more restrained with the rust streaks and running corrosion, and I think those came out looking more realistic. Still, that's part of the process. Sometimes an effect that seems subtle when it's wet becomes much more pronounced once it dries, and sometimes the other way around. Overall, though, I'm happy with the result. Last stretch now. For this stage, we're going to apply a brown wash over all the groundstones. As usual, I'll dip the brush into the paint and then thin it down with thinner before applying it. I'll put it on quite generously, letting it settle into the details. Afterwards, I'll soak up the excess with a paper tissue. Final layer of oil wash, applied the same way as the previous layer. At this point, I have to admit that matching the next tiles perfectly is almost impossible to judge. Right now I only have one finished tile to compare with, but there will be more to match later. So let's see how this turns out. There is always a chance that I'll have to go back and adjust or redo some surfaces once all the tiles are completed and placed together. That's part of the challenge with building a modular board. All dried up. Let's add some scenery and see if we're satisfied with the result. If it looks like this without epoxy resin, I'll be quite happy. Also, to recap, The joints between the 3D printed toppers are not invisible but acceptable. I don't think anyone will mind them too much once the gaming is underway. And now to the matter of matching the colors between the different tiles. As you can see, they are not identical, but they are quite close. Getting a perfect match is a challenge. I'm not really sure how I would fix it if the difference was much bigger without having to redo or tamper with all the layers. What do you think? Is the difference too noticeable, or is it acceptable? Maybe you know an easy way to improve it without affecting all the layers. Feel free to leave a comment. Any thoughts, suggestions, or insights are always valuable and appreciated. Overall, this was fun painting, and I learned a lot from it. In the next video, I'll be pouring the epoxy resin onto these tiles. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.